My favorite Seiko and one of my favorite dive watches is this, the Seiko Glacier Marine Master Reduced. I love this watch and fell in love with it at first sight thanks to its glacier textured dial. If you're a regular viewer, you already know this. But the reason I'm bringing it up is because when WatchDives recently reached out to me and asked if I wanted to review some of their watches, many of which are homage watches, the first one I focused in on was a Glacier Willard Homage. I mean, it's hard to go wrong with a crisp, clean white dial diver, but I also wanted to see just what they could do with this Glacier dial. And honestly, spoiler alert, this isn't quite as good as the Seiko, but you really shouldn't expect it to be. I mean, this is a $100 watch versus $1,000. And for the price, I gotta say what WatchDives did here is pretty remarkable. And they're getting pretty close to that dial. Now, I'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit, but first let's talk about the watch itself and start with the specs. So this one is a little bit on the bigger side, but it is a Willard, so that is expected, with a width of almost 44 millimeters. However, lug to lug is only 47, and that right there is really the beauty of the Willards and the Turtles, that they may be wide, but they also have a relatively shorter lug to lug. And that makes them much more accessible for more wrist sizes. And it's nice to see here that the crystal is sapphire and that the bezel insert choices are ceramic. And as for choices, you have the option of a black or the blue one like I got. Beyond that, everything else here is fairly standard for an entry-level dive watch. 200 meters of water resistance with a screwed down crown. It's 13.7 millimeters thick, has a 20 millimeter lug width, uses a Seiko NH35A movement, weighs in at a solid 175 grams on its bracelet, give or take a link or two, and at the time of this recording, the price is a low $99. And I think they might put this one on sale right before I publish it. So double check that, and I'll maybe post something down there in the comments if they do. And before we go any further, if you watch the other recent WatchDives video, you'll know that this watch and that other watch were sent to me by them. And they're not asking for them back, hence the promotional tag. That said, let's get to the design. And as you can see, the case is that of a Willard, which is similar to Turtles, where it's this cushiony style case with a brush top and polished smooth flowing sides. As divers go, it's one of the more recognizable cases out there, with the difference in the Willard from the Turtles being this really pronounced crown guard area. And I think the Turtle, more so than any other Seiko style case out there, really embodies that tool watch aesthetic. Personally, I do like more of the other streamlined style Seiko cases better, with the Monster and my Marine Master being my favorites. But at the same time, I've owned a Turtle and I can understand why so many love them. It's a subtle, interesting design, and it works well here, keeping the main focus on the bezel and this Glacier style dial. Speaking of the bezel, the action here is good, and probably better than most of the Seikos I've run across. It's 120 click, unidirectional, and the insert here is ceramic, so all good stuff. The bezel itself is a little bit narrow and harder to get a hold of, but once you do get a good grip, you'll hear that satisfying clicky action. I already mentioned that there's two different bezel options. There's this one and then the black one. But I think the blue one, like I have here, works much better with the white Glacier dial than the black would. And especially with the vibrant blue second hand. I'm sure that's already caught your eye. Now, if you've never seen a Glacier Seiko before, the effect of the dial is the same here, where it's this linear, kind of randomized texture going down the dial. Sort of like some of the linear scratching you've seen on other watches, like the Omega Railmaster. But here, again, it's a lot more randomized and it's a lot more texture to it. And the whole aim of it is to make it look like you're looking at the side of a glacier. But unlike a lot of other textured dials, there's still a glossy metallic finish to this one. And when you put all of that together, it's unlike any other dial I've run across, which is why my Marine Master is still one of my favorite divers. And as I said earlier, I'll go over how the two compare, but for now, let's just say that this one from WatchDives is still pretty cool to see. And I think it adds a unique twist on the classic white dial diver formula. Contrast is still a weak point. It's like that with all white dial divers, especially when you're comparing it to a normal black or blue diver. But I think the texture here does enable a little bit more contrast from the white loomed hands and indices than you'd normally get. So helping out a little bit in that department, while still maintaining the clean, crisp look which is characteristic of a white dial diver. And one thing I particularly like here is the vibrant blue second hand, adding just a touch of interesting color. It doesn't distract from the overall design, but it's enough to catch your eye. For a $100 watch, it's a pretty remarkable dial. But at the same time, you gotta remember it is only $100, so it's not gonna be perfect. And the main shortcomings I noticed, I think, are in the hands and the indices, where the indices rise out of the dial, but just slightly. There is some depth, but not a lot, and overall it does feel a bit flat. But again, at that price, there are some compromises. And it does come across as a really sharp, good-looking diver, with an interesting dial and a well-built tooly case. As entry-level divers go, this is giving you almost everything you could want at a bargain price. As for the LUME, well, the LUME is pretty decent. It's a nice bright application of BGW9. And as for longevity, well, the dial here could be a bit better. And I think you can see that in my longevity test. But the hands do last as long as my monster. So not bad for a $100 diver. Which is also what you could say about the bracelet. Like the other WatchDives watch I recently reviewed, there is a little bit of slop and wiggle to the hinged area of the clasp. But other than that, it's actually a pretty great bracelet for the price. Solid links and a milled clasp with a ton of micro adjusts, as well as solid female end links and just a slight taper to make it a little bit more comfortable. However, when it does come to comfort, this is still a Willard with an almost 44mm wide case. So you gotta kinda keep some expectations in check. Now, Willards and Turtles are well known for being remarkably comfortable for their size, almost amazingly so. Most of which is thanks to that shorter in proportion lug-to-lug we talked about. If you've ever worn a Turtle, you know exactly what I'm talking about here. They still wind up feeling a little bit wide, but not necessarily tall. And somehow this cushiony turtle case shape makes it feel more comfortable on your wrists than you'd ever expect it to. It's a design a lot of people love, and it almost seems to defy physics. Almost. Because remember, it is still 44mm. And that's really what makes this case hard to recommend to people. Some love it, some don't, and you almost have to wear one beforehand to know where you fit in that. Personally, I've comfortably worn this one and other Turtles in the past. And the only time I've ever really had an issue is during the summer, and particularly this summer. Because here in Texas, when you got 100-degree days with 90% humidity, that's when this watch starts to feel a little stifling. And I start wishing it had a strap instead of the bracelet, or something here to help the airflow. So maybe not the best watch for summers in Texas. But my main point here is just to know all of this before going into it. That to know there is a chance you might not like it, but there's also a chance you might love it. Now, before we wrap this whole thing up, I just want to talk about how good this Glacier Dial is compared to my Seiko. And do remember that this costs about 1/10 of my Seiko. So you really shouldn't expect it to be that good, but I know some people are going to ask, so I figured I might as well just talk about it. Now, for the texture itself, I'd say it's maybe about 70% there. With the naked eye at arm's length, it's going to look pretty close. But when you take a closer look, that's when you start to notice that's a little more shallow, that it lacks some of the subtle depth of the Seiko version. And I think that's something you could say about the hands and the indices as well. They're not as tall and they aren't as defined. And it gives the entire dial a more shallower feel. It's kind of like comparing a 1080 image to something in 4K. The other just seems a little bit more live. And again, I'd say it's maybe 60 to 70% there, which for the price is pretty hard to complain about. Bottom line, for the price, like $100, maybe less with a sale, this is a pretty amazing watch. It's a solid, well-made diver that gives you almost everything you could want, with a killer unusual dial, at least compared to the other standard matte or sunburst dial divers out there. And I think the Glacier texture adds a really cool twist on the classic white dial diver formula, where it still has this clean, beautiful, and versatile style. It adds an interesting visual element that draws you in more. And really, there are only two reasons I can think of as to why this isn't an obvious no-brainer. And the first of which is that this isn't the only great 100 dial diver out there. The rise of the Chinese homage brands like Steel Dive, San Martin, those have really changed the game in the affordable watch world. So because of them and now WatchDives, there are a lot of great affordable, well-made options out there. And if you're just getting into watches and you don't have a lot of money and just want to focus on the entry-level stuff, it's a good time to start collecting. I mean, these are a lot better than the Vostoks I started out with. Well, they may not quite have the same level of character, but quality-wise, they're a lot better. And this leads me to my second reason, and that's this Willard case design. The Willards, like the Turtles, wear remarkably well for their size. But they are still a little bit chunky with these love handles. And you gotta ask yourself, do you want something more streamlined and slimmer, or do you like big cases and you cannot lie? Either way, there are a lot of great options out there for a good affordable diver, and this is one of them. Now, as usual, let me know your thoughts down below on the watch, on WatchDives, and especially if you've bought a watch from them. I want to hear your experiences. And as always, you guys know what to do down below. It's pretty standard these days. But I'm Shane, this is Relative Time, and I'll see you next time.